for me, I joined specifically to be a Navy SEAL, but I was really bad at math. And I always struggle with math even to this day. In fact, I was so bad at math that I didn't qualify to even be a Navy SEAL, right? I missed it by like 2-3 points on the ASVAB, which for those who don't know, it's kind of like the SAT for the military. It's your aptitude battery. And so I spent my first 2 years after graduated boot camp. I went to, since we all have what's called a rate, and the other, like Army Marine Corps, it's called an MOS, but it's our occupational specialty. And mine was kind of a Navy plumber known as a home maintenance technician. And so after boot camp, as was the plan all along, I would go to what's called HTA school in Philadelphia, learn how to be kind of a Navy plumber. And from there, because I couldn't get orders to BUD/S because I didn't qualify, I ended up going to Groton, Connecticut, where I worked on fast attack submarines at a shore facility there. But I fell in with an older guy who left the SEAL teams to be closer to his family in New England. And so he was working as a photographer there on the Navy base, and he took it upon himself to kind of mentor some of us that had, aspirations of joining the SEAL teams. And so I did that. I was there. I served my 2 years up there. And in the meantime, I got more mature, more mentally and physically prepared for the rigors that would follow in BUD/S training. And so I did 2 years there. And then in the summer of 95, I actually got orders and went out to SEAL training. Well, it's, you got to do math in the military, and when you're a kid, you're like, why would I ever need that? But when you actually are operating in the SEAL teams, starting with training, and it's funny because not only did I almost not get into the SEAL teams because of math, I actually almost failed out of SEAL training because of math, because in the second phase of training, you do, it's dive phase, where you learn all about diving. And part of diving is dive medicine and dive physics. And dive physics involves the worst form of math, which is the word problem, where you learn all the different things and you learn dive tables. And there's a lot of math involved with making sure that you're allowing for pressures at different atmospheres. And then just understanding how dive physics works, they test you on it in word problem. And then as you advance, when it comes to demolition, then you have different calculations, not just for explosive weights, but also for your safe distance to be away from not only the shockwave, but also kind of the fragmentation. And then as a sniper, I had to do a lot of math to estimate range, distance, and those type of calculations. And so it really is a part of it. And even as free fall parachutist, as a free fall jump master, you have to calculate wind speeds as well. So there's actually a lot of math involved. Fortunately, at least then you get to kind of break out your calculator. Boot camp is just, it's for a lot of kids, right? And I say kids, 18, 19, it's your first time away from home. And so it's a lot of it's sleep deprivation. It's the stress of like a high flow of information. And there's areas where they intentionally stress you out, but it's really not that difficult. It's like, just keep your head down, pay attention, execute the orders, fold your clothes, like basically process simple instructions, demonstrate that you can receive information and do what you're told, and pay attention to detail. And it's a lot of that. Can you be trained? It's an aptitude to see, are you suitable enough? Can you work in a team? Can you be trained? But it's very, very easy. Once you get to SEAL training, it's a huge difference, I should say. It's a legit selection process. And historically, depending on where you track it, the attrition rate's anywhere from 75 to 90%, will not be successful. And within that, you have your major milestones, which is Hell Week. And Hell Week is basically 6 days, 5.5 days, where you're subjected to cold water, sleep deprivation. You hardly sleep the whole week, constant physical activity, working in a boat crew, carrying logs, carrying your boats. It's just really it's really to see your drive, your commitment, and also how well you collaborate in a team. Are you willing to put the needs of your team, of your boat crew, of the mission above your own suffering, right? Will you work in a team? Will you be the type of person that can do those things? And to me, people are always asking me, well, what was the hardest part, right? And Hell Week, physically definitely the hardest part, but where I think it's a lot of unexpected is early on, even before you get to Hell Week. I think Hell Week back then was like the 6th or 8th week of training. I can't remember exactly, but the first, you're in first phase. You have 3 phases. The first phase, they're roughly about 9 weeks each. And the first phase, you start off with a very large class. Well, there's a ton of people right off the bat. They're kind of just giving it the college try. Maybe their heart's really not in it. So they want to hurry up and weed those people out as quickly as possible. And so your first phase starts off with a room inspection, and no one's going to pass that. You get wet and sandy. You just get kind of tortured and beat down and constant physical activity just to weed those people out. And I think, like any challenge that you face in life, it's easy to be overwhelmed by the enormity of the goal you're trying to achieve, right? You look at it and you're like, the first week, you're just getting the hell beat out of you. And you're like, well, how am I going to do this for another, 5 3/4 months? But really, those who are successful have to kind of detach and say, you know what? One bite at a time, right? That whole cliche, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Make it to the next meal. And for me, I realized, as hard as all this is, they can't keep doing it with this level of intensity, because eventually they're going to have to start teaching us some stuff, right? So I knew I just wait it out, just keep going. And for me, I never got to the point where I was going to quit, that I felt like quitting. But I did question whether I had what it takes, right? The next second phase of training is known as dive phase. You do pull comp. That's the neck pull competency. That's the next thing that weeds out the large amount of people. And unlike Hell Week, which is all about gutting it out and misery, pull comp is about performing specific sequences in 100% in accordance with the instruction while you're starved for air. So it's that acute kind of pressure. Can you be calm, cool, and collected in the face of fear? And I always wondered, can I get through that? Then you get the third phase, land navigation. Well, that sounds really hard. So I always was like, man, I kind of had this voice of negativity sometimes. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can make it. It's like this big monster, this big dragon you don't know if you could slay. But each time that I stepped up, it was never harder than I could handle. It wasn't quite as bad as I had built it up to be in my mind. Like now how they do it is you go through the initial BUDS training, which is 6 months. And then from there, you have what's called SEAL qualification training, which is another 6 months. And so with that, you get your jump training, you get static line, you get free fall training, you get more advanced tactics. And then you go to Alaska and do like some cold weather stuff. And BUDS is really just an assessment. You learn very, very basic land warfare and diving skills. SQT starts to bridge that gap between the assessment and actually learning things that prepare you to move at a much higher pace once you get to a SEAL team. So when I went through, I graduated in 95. And after that, we had to go to Fort Benning, Georgia to go through Army jump school. It's a 3-week school that should only take about a week, in all honesty, but the Army drags it out before we moved it in-house. So you go to the jump school and then you go back to your respective team, either maybe to California for the West Coast teams, out to Hawaii, or as in my case, to the East Coast. And for me, I show up as a new guy at SEAL Team 2, which is not the most hospitable environment, right? A lot of abuse as a new guy, just doing all the grunt work. I was one of the more junior guys of my class. So a lot of the guys that showed up, they went right into the next, what was called STT, SEAL Tactical Training class. Well, for me, I had to wait 6 months to even get it. So I'm not a Navy SEAL. I don't have a Trident because I haven't been through the qualification course, the tactical training course. So I had to wait 6 months. So I waited 6 months, and then I finally got my STT class, which was another 6 months. And back then, you spent a couple months down in Puerto Rico doing diving, and then like maritime operations, learning how to navigate in your boats and all those things. And then you go up to what was back then Fort AP Hill for land warfare. And then after that, you go before a review board, and they ask you a bunch of questions. And if they feel like you're worthy at that point, then they'll award you your Trident. And then only then are you officially a Navy SEAL. So you're talking like a year and a half, probably even after I graduated buds, before I was even a Navy SEAL. And by then, I got to be honest, man, it was just kind of like, all right, got the Trident. That's cool. I'm already in a SEAL platoon now. And I don't know, it was a little bit anticlimactic. I mean, there definitely was that sense of accomplishment when you graduated buds. Like there's a sense of accomplishment when you finished Hell Week, when you finished pool comp, when you got off the island, which your third phase of training is land warfare out on San Clemente Island. But you're always like, well, you're always very guarded, or at least I was. Well, I haven't done it yet. All right, I finally got my Trident. Well, I haven't finished my first SEAL deployment. Because we kick guys out all the time. Like the guys will make it to a SEAL team, and now after SQT, they'll show up with a Trident. But because they can't pick it up, they can't work at that speed, a lot of times we'll have to kick him out. And every SEAL platoon that I was in, we lost somebody for some reason in training. But so it was always kind of anticlimactic. It was never like I have arrived, because you're always proving yourself. You're always like, okay, cool, got my Trident. Nobody cares. You better figure your shit out. You better hit the ground running. You better be good at this. So you're always focused on, what do I have to do next to prove myself? And even after you've been in a few teams for a few years, then you're going to be in a leadership position. Well, you better prove yourself in that position too, because now you're being judged by the guys that you're leading. So kind of like you can never get comfortable.
What was your first deployment like?
I had a blast. It's funny. I loved my combat time. Obviously everybody's experiences are different, but I just was connecting with the guy. I think like 2 years ago, we went skiing together. I hadn't seen the guy in 20 years. I was really, really lucky. Even though it's a brand new guy and you get a little bit of abused, I had such a great amount of really, really talented guys that were willing to teach me and mentor me, and guys that I just love being with. And so we deployed to Germany, and that, again, 1998. And one of the guys, he's kind of well-known, Neil Roberts. He was the first SEAL killed after 9/11 in Afghanistan, Roberts Ridge, from that battle. He was kind of like what we call my sea daddy. I spent a lot of time with him on that deployment. And just the greatest guy, was always teaching me how to do something, how to tweak my gear, just watching out for me, taking care of me like a big brother I never had. And so for us, it was a lot of, we had a sister platoon from a different SEAL team. And so we were kind of switching back and forth. One crew would go down to Bosnia, and then the rest of us who weren't there, we would be going on what we call JSETs, which are joint combined exercise training, where you basically go with, as this case in Europe, a European partner special operations unit. So for us, we did like a jump trip with the Danish Frogman. So we did about probably a week and a half of skydiving with them, just fun stuff. Went to, I think, some Eastern European countries. And that was back, it wasn't that far after kind of the Cold War. So you really got to see kind of almost how primitive some of these Eastern Bloc countries were in terms of their capability. So we're working with them. And then we got a chance to go into Bosnia for a few months, which was cool. Nothing like combat really, but at least you were kind of doing something. Because back then, between Gulf War, Panama, and 9/11, any little thing that was like a real operation, even if there wasn't shooting, you would thirst for it. So we're doing some of that, and we get back from that, and then we found ourselves on the hook, because back then we were also responsible for covering down, besides Europe, we also were covering down for Africa. And back then you always had so much unrest in a lot of these countries where we have our embassies, that we were always worried about our embassies being overrun. There'd be rockets and RPGs being fired over our embassies, kind of not targeting us, but kind of in the line of fire. So a lot of cases, if those embassies were kind of near the water, we'd be on the hook for contingencies to go do an evacuation operation. And so we did actually launch on one of those. One of the embassies, I think it was Liberia, was about to get overrun, and we ended up taking our birds, flying into Africa And then we ended up riding on half of us were riding on a what they call it, a PC, which is like a really small ship. The Navy doesn't have them anymore, where we're kind of off the coast waiting to do something. And then the other half of us were sitting like in an embassy in the next country over, just waiting. And so nothing really came of it. It was kind of like you're all amped up, ready to go, but then they just very easily got the guys out, and we were like, all right, well, I guess we'll go home. So that was my first deployment. Yeah, so I would say after that deployment, I went to sniper school, had a shorter workup, and then I deployed overseas. And this time we used to be also attached to ships or carrier groups. And so we were attached to a carrier group, and we were known as what was called a strike platoon. And so I was on, the JFK, the old JFK was the last non-nuclear powered submarine. And so we deployed over to the Middle East and doing, again, exercises in, different Jordan and, Kuwait. And then we actually got my first taste of like some real operations we would do, because a lot back then there was a lot of ships that were breaking through the embargo that we had on Iraq. And so we ended up taking down different ships that were smuggling. We ended up, I think the big operation for us was taking over a Russian oil tanker. And that was like big news back then. It was like really kind of high level for us. Ended up taking over that oil tanker, even though it wasn't like a difficult operation. Got back from that. I deployed back to UCOM again. This time our guys were going into Kosovo, back when that was a thing. I was probably a little over halfway through the deployment, getting ready to go to Kosovo, and was doing a jump over Scotland and got injured, tore my pec, separated my shoulder. So I ended up having to get sent home. So I'm like back home, had surgery when 9/11 happens. The guys are still overseas. But it was a little while before we were actually employed. And so I kind of just sat there for a while. I had orders to go to a special missions unit, which I kind of had to cancel because of my injury. So I ended up working in training for a while, training guys to go overseas. And so being an instructor, I taught assault training, which is kind of your close quarter combat, your urban warfare, like we call SALC, Special Operations Urban Combat, in these little urban cities for training. And then I also did the VBSS training, like the ship assault training. And then it wasn't until 2004 that I actually got to go overseas, and that was straight to Iraq. And so we went over to Iraq. Initially, guys were doing assaults training. They were doing like close quarter. They're doing basically assaulting buildings, wrapping up guys, wrapping up insurgents. And then we got tasked with basically doing the mobile security detail for the fledgling Iraqi government. And so basically, like if you envision kind of what the Secret Service does for the president, well, that's what each of us, we had the SEAL platoons over there, East and West Coast, and that was our primary function. We went to kicking doors in, right, having fun, to actually now being like bodyguards, which was okay. The fun thing for me, I got to be the advance, so I'd often get to go out in advance of certain things and really kind of make sure that everything was set up. On occasions, our guy that we were doing was a Kurd, so his home was in Kurdistan, and so we would often take as an advance, we'd load up some armored Ford Explorers in the back of CH-47s, and we'd fly up there, and we'd kind of connect with kind of the Kurdish militia and really prepare everything. But it's also during that time when we were getting a lot of rockets and a lot of mortars inside of where we were in the green zone, which is where the capital was. You had the green zone, which was really heavily guarded. And then you had the red zone, was everything out there. Well, since we're getting so many rockets at the Iraqi government, we would actually, a lot of us who were snipers and communicators, radio operators, we would get to go out in an attempt to kind of engage these. And that's really where I kind of got my first taste of combat on some of these sniper operations. And, I will say what's noteworthy of that in my career was probably my first actual combat operation. We went out on a couple sniper ops at night. where, they could probably kind of see we were there and they'd be shooting at us, but it wasn't really effective fire. And we would witness certain things like we'd have like the Army, some of the small armored vehicles, they would be lighting up some of these cars. And that was kind of cool to see, if I'm being honest. But one afternoon I'm on a rooftop and it was kind of I was whatever it was. I won't throw people under the bus, but I got put in a bad area. It was me and a sniper teammate and some Army guys, and we're trying to do some overwatch for a patrol that would be coming down the road. And we were kind of at a little lower level, and it's kind of one of those things where you're looking down the street, and you're seeing some kids are playing below, and there's some people outside of cafes doing their thing, some cars going by, and it's kind of like where you just start to kind of feel your spidey senses. And all of a sudden we start taking heavy fire and it starts picking up. And then we start receiving fire from the rear. And so we're kind of getting fire in the front and back. And, myself, my sniper buddy, we're engaged in threats across the street. And then somehow, we had Army guys in the lower levels of this building. It's probably like a 3-story building. And somebody had breached the perimeter. And next thing I know is I got my teammate, he's jumping past me and he's yelling grenade. An enemy grenade bounced off the ledge and like hit him right in the forehead before like falling right at my feet. And I'm sitting on these sandbags and the grenade just goes off. And I'm thinking, I'm dead, but somehow miraculously, like I was unscathed. And I look at him and we're both just kind of stunned, and he's got blood coming down the front of his head. And I'm thinking, I'm waiting for him to kind of keel over and die like in the movies. But the cut in his head was actually from the grenade hitting him in the head before it went off, which was, and so then we're kind of pinned down and we decide, all right, we're going to bring up the heavy weapons and start to suppress some of the fire and try to get off that rooftop. And what's funny is before that, when we're sitting there hanging out, I'm looking through my sniper rifle and I had binoculars, I had a laser rangefinder. So I'm kind of lasing, getting the distance, kind of building what's, target reference points. And the Army guy's like, hey, can I borrow your binoculars? Because, so that they're looking too. And one of the guys in the rangefinder has like a magnification. The second we start taking fire and we bound back. So I go like through a hail of gunfire and make it back behind, a little, I don't know, like a cupola, like a little block. And then we got to go another short distance to go down a ladder to get off the main part of the roof. And all of a sudden I look at the Army guys. I'm like, hey, where's my shit? And they just kind of look at me and they point back to where we just came, and they left my binoculars and my rangefinder there. And I'm like, and I probably did one of the stupidest things in my life. I ran out there through another hail of gunfire to grab my binoculars and my rangefinder because I wasn't going to be the guy that got shot at for the first time and left all his shit there. So yeah, that was stupid, but I made it through. We got off that rooftop, and it was kind of a defining moment for me because I think for all of us who train, we kind of anticipate being in combat. You always wonder, how will you respond, or, how effective is your training? And then for me, as somebody who, speaks, to different organizations, it really is a validation that you train with the right skills. You make it as realistic as possible, but you also got to speak to how you're going to be able to execute those skills under pressure when you're facing kind of the emotions of fear, the distraction. Like, will you be able to get control of yourself to do and execute the right skills? Because you learn all these skills and you could just be like a robot, but you have to be mindfully present enough to make sure you're employing the right skills. So that was the big thing. That was probably the really big defining moment for me. Went out on a few more of those. Fortunately, they weren't as kind of dramatic as that one. But, as we record this, we have all that horrible stuff going on in Israel. And I think it reminds me of like just some of the savagery that we would see. Nothing compared to kind of what you're talking about that intimate, just barbaric behavior. But back then we would be right near a gate and you would just hear these massive explosions like nearby. You'd feel it, right? Because it was close enough and it was big enough. And each time that happened, you just knew, right? And I remember coming up on a scene, where they had started cleaning up a lot of it, because we would go there because a lot of times the guys that we were with, they'd want to kind of show their face amongst the kind of crowds to say, hey, we're here. And it was basically like a vehicle-borne IED. And you just see the carnage, just the blood but for whatever reason, I don't know, kind of like a protective mechanism. I remember, just seeing this little white shoe just in there, like a little, like a bloody shoe of, I don't know, a 2-year-old, 3-year-old girl who was one of probably 150 people that were killed by these savages, and, I think that was really my first exposure just to people that, and I would see this in Afghanistan to a degree too, that just don't view human life the same way that we do in the West, especially when it comes to children, which is just something that is really hard to get your head around. People don't value the life of a child the same way that we do, right? And they use that against us, right? In Iraq, they would pay people, stories we would hear, $100, $200 maybe to a 10-year-old boy to come out and throw a grenade at us, right? Because, we were not going to be wanting to shoot back at a kid. But yeah, anyway, but that's the whole point is really kind of how you process experiences like that, right? Your first combat, your first kind of reality check that people in the world don't always see things the way you do, right?
What was your experience in Iraq overall like? And how long were you there?
Yeah, so I did a few deployments to Iraq. One short trip to Afghanistan, another deployment to Afghanistan. To me, Iraq, my experience is Iraq is more, in one particular deployment, it's very urban. It's like a city. And then one deployment would be kind of in a more rural area where maybe we would be kind of operating on the western part of the country. So we'd have more built up areas like Fallujah, but we also found ourselves in the kind of a lot more rural farm areas. So some nights you'd be going through a city just like you would envision a Middle Eastern city to look like, not skyscrapers, but, rows of kind of walled in compounds all in line, looking very much the same. Couple stories. And then you'd find yourself kind of trudging through, almost like sometimes knee deep in mud, going really slowly and basically conducting an operation on a compound, a series of buildings out in the middle of nowhere, which is kind of like, I guess, Afghanistan in that respect, only without the hills. And so it's a lot more like a lot of my experience in Iraq was a lot of guys concentrated. You have a lot of guys hitting a building. And then as it progressed, we'd be kind of like in every campaign or operation, we always are trying to work ourselves out of a job. And so how you do that is you develop capacity of your partner force. And so this would be, Iraqi special forces. So the goal is always to have them do more and more while maintaining the safety of your force, right? But there are always the limitations of they can't really control aircraft and they can't deconflict battle spaces with other conventional units. So they always need us as an advisor. But eventually you want to get them to do most of the work. So I think my last deployment in Afghanistan was with commando units. And so you have a whole bunch. You're talking maybe 120 like Afghans sometimes, like company size. And then a handful of, maybe, 12, 15, SEAL operators, maybe some Army guys thrown in there, maybe some Air Force guys. And now, rather than going in and assaulting a smaller compound, you're all spread out. So you may split your force. You may have one taking a valley here, another one taking a valley there. And so now as a leader, it's more challenging because your span of control is much greater. So now you're not like, in Iraq as an assault force commander, I'm looking around the corner to see what my guys are doing. Well, now I'm kind of like, can hardly see anybody from my vantage point. Maybe I'm looking over my imagery, my map. People are checking in with me, and as a senior enlisted leader, I'm now informing the ground force commander. So that type of stuff. And for me, I also spent a lot of time, as I became more senior in rank, in tactical operations centers, where I'm actually sitting behind a computer, looking at all the screens and kind of just helping coordinate things. Not as fun as being on the ground, but yeah. Eventually you get to where you work yourself out of the fun jobs.
What was Afghanistan like?
Again, for me, it just different in terms of, if you think about Colorado or something, if you've ever out west, I mean, there's some really pretty areas, some really, really high mountains, and just, a lot of kind of like high desert type of terrain. But you're dealing with people that are completely different. You're dealing with, an Arabic population, Kurds, other kind of ethnic minorities in Iraq. But for the most part, Arabic people that are very much akin to kind of, Western in terms of culture, and not completely dissimilar. But once you go to Afghanistan, now you're dealing with, a much more primitive style, middle-aged type environment, just because people, they are so isolated and they're so tribal. You have a bunch of different tribes and cultures in different areas. And so they just don't have, right? They don't have the technology. And it's just, again, just very primitive. The buildings are a lot more primitive, almost like adobe type of dwellings you'd see. And in a lot of cases that you'd see like in the old Southwest of the United States for Native American cultures, but just that type of thing. And not really. And you're also taken by, because they're not very literate in many cases. Now, when you move to the cities, the Kabul, Kandahar, places like that, obviously it's a different story, but a lot of places we would work, at least it would be out in the middle of nowhere. And so they don't always really, what was striking to me is they didn't always understand the difference between kind of, for example, what would be written in religious texts. And they didn't really understand the difference between that and their own history, their own culture. And often we would find is that we would often have, partner forces with us. Sometimes maybe we'd have like some Jordanians. And you would think because, both they have the religion of Islam, both Muslims, that they would get along much better than we, kind of the white Christians. But in reality, they would butt heads over their understanding and interpretation of the religion. So oftentimes, we wouldn't have that barrier. It would be like, we talk about, hey, you're religious. Well, we'd say, well, we're religious too, but where do we agree? We agree on family and that type of stuff. And you'd find ways to bridge connections. So I found that really interesting. But you're also dealing, even though they may be more primitive in their understanding of technology and things like that, you're dealing with a very hard people, very tough, rugged people that only know, in many cases, they only know warfare. And I never found this, but I would have a lot of people, even later on, after we'd been there for years, when they would sit there and they'd do an engage, or maybe an engagement, or they'd assault a compound, and they'd sit there and they'd be questioning these people. And you're talking, I don't know, 2008, 2009 still, and they still think that these people are Russians. They don't even know. They think that we're Russians. And so when we explain why we're there, 9/11, a lot of them would be like, well, we understand that. That's revenge. We understand why you're here now. So just very interesting in terms of